On December 7, 1941, tragedy struck the United States of America. The infamous event of Pearl Harbor claimed many lives, and other lives were changed forever. As tragedy struck our nation, people had to step up and take charge. Others had to step up to save lives. Citizens were frightened, soldiers were wounded. Both citizens and soldiers lost their lives. Even though Pearl Harbor was catastrophic, our nation rallied together to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. Pearl Harbor will forever be embedded in the United States history. During the early 1940s, the United States of America and Japan were trying to negotiate a plan to keep peace between their countries. Throughout this time period, many events caused a ripple in the negotiations. According to the Journal of American East Asian Relations, on July 26, 1941, the United States froze all of Japan's dollar assets within the states. Also, the United States stopped all oil imports to Japan, which caused many problems because oil was Japan's most needed import. With all that was happening, the United States tried to renegotiate peace terms, but what America did not know is that the Japanese were planning a deadly attack. Japan broke off all negotiations 30 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And with the end of the negotiations, the attack on American soil began. With attack comes weapons, and the Japanese came prepared. The Japanese dropped bombs and shot out torpedoes from their submarines. According to the underwater archaeology of the attack on Pearl Harbor, 5 midget submarines were deployed before the attack on Pearl Harbor. These midget subs were stationed around the harbor waiting for the attack to begin, and would then set out and destroy any battleships that came in their way with their torpedoes. During the first wave attack, 153 planes were set out to destroy, and 45 minutes later, 171 planes launched in for the second wave. Kate, Val, and Zero planes were the different types of planes used in the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. Overall, the attack lasted around 2 hours. Although the attack came as a surprise, the American military had weapons on standby and transportation stationed in the harbor. The United States had 8 battleships stationed at Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor. Among those ships were the USS Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and the USS Pennsylvania. Among the 8, 2 were destroyed. The USS Arizona was the first battleship to be destroyed and claimed half of the casualties. Another battleship was capsized, and that was the USS Utah. But the USS Utah was not stationed in the harbor. It was stationed right off of Ford Island. Only 2 P-36 planes became airborne during the attack. According to the Los Angeles Times, Kenneth M. Taylor was the first of 2 pilots to become airborne during the attack and shot down at least 6 Japanese aircrafts. By the end of Pearl Harbor, 29 Japanese planes were shot down. The attack on Pearl Harbor killed 2,403 Americans and wounded 1,104. But someone had to take care of the wounded and the dead. The nurses at Pearl Harbor are not talked about much, but were a big part of the tragic event. With being in a war zone, the nurses had to be quick on their feet and think on the spot. They had to come up with ways to separate the ones who could be saved, the ones who were not going to make it, and the ones who were already dead. During all the chaos, as soldiers and civilians were coming into the hospital, the nurses had to come up with a way to separate those who could be saved, the ones who could not, and the ones who were already dead. With not many supplies available, the nurses had to use red lipstick to mark the patient's foreheads upon arrival. They would mark if they were dead or who could be saved. And a lot of times they would mark M on their foreheads if they needed morphine. They also had to stage the dead behind the buildings to make more room inside the hospital. After the attack, most of the nurses received special merits by the military. According to the National Women's History Museum, Annie G. Fox was the first woman to receive the Purple Heart. On December 8, 1941, after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation. His speech told about the bombing of Pearl Harbor and all of the lives lost. During his speech, he asked Congress for a state of war against the Japanese Empire. This moment in time was so important that President Roosevelt, who was in a wheelchair, stood for the event. To make his speech even more remarkable, he wrote it himself without any help from the presidential writers. He rallied the nation in support for our full participation in the war. The Day of Infamy speech marked the start of World War II for the United States. During the recent 76th anniversary in December 2017, about 20 survivors, several thousand Navy sailors and officials, as well as the public, attended a ceremony overlooking the harbor and the USS Arizona Memorial, which is actually built across the sunken battleship. At the Pearl Harbor Virtual Reality Center, you can virtually walk on the deck of the USS Arizona before it was sunk. You can also see the remains of the USS Utah, which was brought in closer to the harbor, but it is still capsized. The attack on Pearl Harbor will be remembered in American history till the end of time. After peace negotiations were broken off between the United States of America and the Japanese Empire, warplanes took flight. Bombs were dropped, ships were sunk, but most importantly, lives were lost. Nurses stepped up to take care of the fallen. After 76 years, people can still visit Pearl Harbor to honor the men and women who lost their lives in the attack. According to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, December 7, 1941, will be a date that will live in infamy.